Hello and welcome. We are going to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Hirschfelder. I'm with the programming team here at the Commonwealth Club. It is wonderful to have people here in person. We also have a crowd of people watching online, so welcome to those watching online. But we are very excited to have a crowd of people here. We have been bringing people back for in-person programs for a few months now, and we are continuing to increase over the coming weeks and months more in-person programs, which is very exciting to have people back in our beautiful building. So welcome. Quick question before we start. Members, do we have any members here? Terrific. Glad to see our members. Welcome. Thank you for sticking with us over the last 20 months. It is a great time to become a member, so please learn more about us at commonwealthclub.org. Real quick, and also before I turn over the program, please turn off your phones. You don't want to be that person who is not only captured here at the program, but also online hearing your ringtone. Okay. We will be taking questions both online. Please post them in the YouTube chat as well as here in the room. You see some cards there. We'll bring them up to Daniel Handler throughout the program. So with that, I am very pleased to turn the program over to one of the Daniels here, Daniel Handler, who will be our moderator for our program with Daniel Sokach to discuss his new book, Can We Talk About Israel? So with that, I turn it over to Daniel Handler.
Hi. Oh, people are coming in. Hello, good evening, welcome to the Commonwealth Club. We're very happy to have people in person. As was said, my name is Daniel Handler. I will be speaking with Daniel Sokach about his new book, Can We Talk About Israel? A Guide for the Curious, Confused, and Conflicted. Before jumping into our program, I will read a quick bio of Mr. Sokach. He has served as the CEO of the New Israel Fund since 2009. Before joining NIF, Daniel served as the executive director of the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, the Peninsula, Marin, and Sonoma counties. Prior to his tenure at the Federation, he was the founding executive director of the Progressive Jewish Alliance, now Bend the Arc. I feel like people are not going to say, who are you to write a book about Israel? But what took you so long? And in recognition of his leadership, Daniel has been named 4 times to the Forward newspaper's Forward 50, an annual list of 50 leading Jewish decision makers and opinion shapers. Although I think it is safe to say that just because you have not been named to the list, you may still be a Jew who's done interesting things and thinks interesting things. Perhaps you've contributed something to the history of the Gothic novel. And anyway,
there's an argument.
It's all who you know, is what I'm trying to say, and what you're when you're in the Forward 50. But no, I am here, it may seem curious, besides the fact that I'm Jewish and I'm also named Daniel, that I would be chosen to moderate this conversation, but that's not why. It is because Daniel when I first met him, had this idea for this book, and I sometimes with what felt like fish hooks and long ropes, dragged it out of him. And one of the bumps along the road was in Daniel finding a literary agent who might bring it to publication. And so I gave it to my literary agent, and she said, I don't want to think about this. I don't want to think about this. And I said, yeah, that's the book. That's the whole point. There's, on this topic, we're afraid to think about it. We're afraid to speak about it. We think many things that are contradictory and yet sit uneasily in the same mind in all of our minds. And I think that this book is a very, very elegant way of taking us through this extremely thorny issue that makes us not want to read about it. And the book makes us want to read about it, and it's, I think, a extremely necessary and vital book, and I'm happy here to speak about it. So hi.
Hi,
Thanks
Daniel.
for coming on our show today, Daniel. I wanted to start with something that I read about yesterday. It's a news item that I feel is among many news items that could fill this slot, that fills us with this kind of panicky, contradictory anger and nervousness. The University of Toronto's Scarborough Campus Student Union, as part of a general support for Palestinian rights and the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divest, Sanctions movement passed a notion this week where they pledged only to order kosher food from caterers who, and I'm quoting here, do not normalize Israeli apartheid. And I bring this up because your book is a guide for the curious, confused, and conflicted. And when I read a news story like this, I feel curious, confused, and conflicted because I feel attacked and put on the spot, but I also feel sympathetic and engaged with the impetus behind such decisions. So let's talk about this. What would you say to the Scarborough Campus Student Union over up there at the University of Toronto?
Well, first of all, good evening, everybody.
You'd start there.
Always. Adam and crew, thank you for having me here. I've done already probably 25 book events since the book came out last month, all of which have been virtual. And this is the first live one that we've done, and virtual. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in out there. But I have to say, it just feels great to be in a room with people to talk about anything, let alone the book. So I'm grateful to the Commonwealth Club and really to you all for schlepping out to talk about it. Now,
Yeah.
well, I could easily just avoid that question and move on to something else,
Sure.
pivoting dexterously. Look, the working title for this book for much of the period when I was writing it was one that I came up with as kind of a joke and didn't like, but it made a point. And the working title was, you'll forgive me for the mild profanity or the implication of profanity. It was Israel WTF. Why one small country drives so many sane people crazy. And I think that your opening scenario is a terrific example of the shortest answer because of things like that.
Yeah.
Right. And what you described feeling, right? You said that what happened at University of Toronto makes me feel angry and targeted, and also sort of sympathetic and confused and conflicted, if not curious. And I think that there are any number of scenarios that could make any number of people, whether they are Jewish Americans, Arab Americans, Palestinians and Israelis, liberal Christians, evangelical Christians, there are any number of scenarios that put people, when it comes to this debate, this conversation about Israel, in that position of feeling simultaneously sympathetic, attacked, curious, conflicted. And so, I think what I would say to the people, which people are we talking about at the University of Toronto? But, I think what I would say to people who find themselves in the midst of one of those conversations, whether on one of the sides of the debate or watching it horrified or amused or bemused from the sidelines, is slow down. You have to know what you're talking about before you start talking about it. And that's sort of the point of the book, right? There are so few, well, it's not the only topic about which people feel incredibly strongly. They have powerful emotional reactions and feelings, but those powerful emotional reactions and feelings are often not grounded in a good understanding of what we're actually talking about. And I would suspect that the partisans, the people on the extremes of most of the debates on college campuses, not all of them, and around dinner tables and Thanksgiving tables and Shabbat tables, often are similarly people who feel very strongly and who know one part of the story, but like the parable of the blind men and the elephant, they know only that one part of the story. They are sure that what they are encountering is a leg of an elephant or a trunk of an elephant, and that is the whole elephant. But the book is an attempt to have people calm down, step back, and try to see the elephant.
And so, I think for American Jews, which I suspect is a large portion of today's audience, both in the room and online, I think of my own childhood and that being taught a very simple lesson about Israel, basically, that it was that I was raised to love Israel, I would say unabashedly, and that it was a long overdue solution to a diaspora that culminated in the Holocaust. And I think that was the straightforward narrative. And if you were starting to explain Israel to children now, if you were going to take young Jewish children or any children and try to explain it, what should I have heard?
Well, with my own young Jewish children,
Yeah.
and other kids that I've spoken to, Jewish and not young and less young, you know, my approach is, as it would be with adults, Jewish and not Jewish, is to urge people to look at and try to understand the two stories. There are more than two stories, but for our purposes, the two narratives that are most dominant in this story, right? That of the Jewish people who come to Israel after a millennium of horrific persecution and you know, before, during, and then in the wake of the Holocaust, right? The most unimaginably horrific chapter in modern history. To understand with compassion that story, while at the same time understanding with equal amounts of compassion the story of people who happened to be living in that place, right? Who were utterly displaced by the Jews who fled persecution in Europe, right? Again, in the 100 years, in the decades before, during, and after the Holocaust. And in that sense, what I would urge them to do, these kids, is to look at the image I write about in the book, actually, as you may recall, in a section in which I'm talking to a group of kids about this. You know, I often use the metaphor used by the late, great Israeli novelist and peace activist Amos Oz, who said the justification for Israel, for Zionism, he said, but that's a loaded word, which we can unpack later. But the justification for Israel, Oz wrote, is the justification of a drowning person who swims to a plank floating in the sea and clings to it, even though there's already someone there clinging to that plank. And Oz writes, the person is justified to save himself on that plank, even if he has to shove the first person over a little bit to make room. But he doesn't have the right to shove the first person into the sea. And to me, that sort of captures everything. And as I spoke with these kids at my kids' summer camp some years ago, Camp Tawanga, for those of you in the house, you know, an 11-year-old kid listening to this conversation, where I had to do exactly what you asked me, said, well, wait a minute. It's kind of like my family has always lived in this land, and we've always lived in this house, and we never really thought about who owned it 1,000 years ago, but we've lived here for generations, and one day we come back from working our fields, and we see that, and he points to the boy next to him, this kid and his family are in half of our house, and we say, what are you doing in our house? And the kid says to me, well, we come from far away, but once upon a time we lived here, and everyone in our village was murdered except for us. They burned our village down. They kicked us out. No other country would take us, so we came back to this house. And he said, is that kind of like what happened? And I said, Brandon, because his name was Brandon. That's exactly what happened. And I feel that, you know, if a kid from Walnut Creek and Israel's, you know, greatest novelists can understand that, then we all can understand that. And that's how I would speak to the young Daniel Handler.
And do you think what perhaps pernicious and perhaps inadvertent effects do you think we can see in having the wrong message pushed for so long?
Yeah, well, right. I mean, it's so tough because people are so afraid of what happens if you tell people the whole story, right? But Brandon's an example of a kid who heard the whole story briefly, right, in an informal education in the Sierras near Yosemite, and he didn't suddenly say, well, this is all a lie, right? He sort of understood what it was. So I think that there are perceived dangers to telling the truth, but in my opinion, they pale next to the real dangers of not telling the truth about the history of this conflict and what really happened, and then watching kids get older and realize that what they were told feels like a whitewash. And the example I always think of is one that happened to me, and I'm sure it happened to many of you, certainly people in my generation, but it's going to be very different for you as it was for my kids when they got to high school and college, right? And that was, you know, getting to college and getting into debates with people. And I remember I did my junior year abroad, and I was in Ireland, as you know, and great year. I write about it in the book. That's really what I'd like to talk about tonight. But I remember having a conversation with kids who were holding a protest against Israel. And in 1988, that was not something that we were used to on campuses anywhere, certainly not at Brandeis University. But they were talking about Deir Yassin, and they had pictures, horrible pictures of a massacre. And I said, "What is this?" And they said, "Well, this was Deir Yassin. This is when Zionist militants went into a village next to Jerusalem and they murdered everyone. They massacred everyone in Israel's War of Independence." And I said to myself, well, that's clearly not true, because there's absolutely no way that the Israel that I learned about from reading Exodus by Leon Uris and seeing an extremely handsome Paul Newman, right? Like every rainy day at summer camp, we saw that. And then from my own informal education, like that was obviously not true. And it wasn't until I grew up a bit and, made it my business in graduate school to study this and learn it, that I realized it was 100% true. And it, in fact, happened just as they said it had happened. And what would have happened if I had been educated about this and had been told, in the wake of that horrific massacre, when Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt, right, wrote an open letter to the New York Times decrying this and saying Jews around the world should be ashamed and should never support, wait for it, Menachem Begin, the leader of one of the militant groups. And in reaction, David Ben-Gurion, right, the founding father of Israel, crushed the militant groups and disarmed them to the point where he ordered his forces, led by a young Yitzhak Rabin, to sink a ship off the coast of Tel Aviv, smuggling arms to the militant groups. So if I had learned that history, I would have been able to have that conversation in a different kind of way. But when my kids get to college and they hear about Deir Yassin, and no one in our informal education system has told them about it, just like it was for me 35 years ago. When they get to college, they go online and they see that it was true, and they think, oh, so you all lied to me. Right? You lied to me at Hillel, and you lied to me at summer camp, and you lied to me at Sunday school, and you lied to me at Hebrew school, and that, I think, is the danger. That's a very long answer to your short question.
Yeah.
That danger is far worse, I think, than telling people Israel is a complicated place and subject like our own country, and it's worth wrestling with, and it's worth understanding warts and all. But if you whitewash it, it's going to backfire.
So I would agree with that. I would also think that it seems to me that sometimes the contradictory ideas that we're holding about Israel are more contradictory than, say, here we are in America, which also has a bloody and violent history that, is going more acknowledged, I would say, in this generation than it has ever been, but has never been acknowledged enough. And I don't think I would assume anyone here who grew up in America has received informal history lessons that turned out not to be accurate.
Right.
But that it feels to me as Americans that those issues are more easily separated and more easily put to rest. We're not there yet, but it feels like a possibility. And sometimes the ideas in Israel feel so directly contradictory. It reminds me actually that a million years ago when I went to look for apartments, before you could look for apartments online, you went into an agency and they had this Venn diagram on the wall that said, great apartment, great location, like reasonable rent. And you could only have two of those things in the Venn diagram. It was a reminder that you couldn't look for a perfect situation. And when I think about Israel and I think about a democratic state, which seems so essential and something that I believe in very strongly, and a Jewish state, which is something that seems essential about Israel's founding and an idea worth preserving, that how is it possible to reconcile those two ideas? Are all those ideas actually contradictory?
Well, your Venn diagram is even more analogous because you had three things, right? Good location, nice place, good rent, right? And of course, when it comes to Israel, it's not just democratic state, Jewish homeland or haven for the Jewish people. There's a third piece, which is since 1967, Israel has controlled, but not annexed, mostly not annexed, territory that contains, at this point in time, millions and millions of people, right? Almost 3 million on the West Bank, almost 3 million in Gaza. and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and it controls their lives and those people to varying degrees. And those people have not received any of the benefits of citizenship or civil rights. So the Venn diagram with Israel is you can be, I would argue, and so did David Ben-Gurion when he came out of self-imposed retirement in July 1967 to a think tank in Jerusalem, and the country was just elated because of the victory in the Six-Day War that put them in this position. And he said, and spoiler alert, nobody listened to him. They didn't want to listen to him. And he was no dove, Ben-Gurion.
Yeah.
He was a tough, dude. But he said, look, we have to give this back. Even if there's no one to whom we really can make peace with right now, we have to give it back. Or we will no longer be able to be a country that is a homeland for the Jewish people and a democracy. We're going to be something else. And he didn't say it, but I would say there's a word for that arrangement, but it isn't in Hebrew, and it isn't in English, and it isn't in Arabic, right? That word is in Afrikaans. And Ben-Gurion saw it in July 1967. So on the one hand, I suppose that's the easy answer. Well, there's no easy answer to your question, but there is an answer to your question that every Israeli prime minister, interestingly, right, from the moment Yitzhak Rabin makes the decision in 1992-93, every Israeli premier, except Mr. Netanyahu, and we don't know about the current occupant, has arrived at the same conclusion. You can have two of those 3 points of identity on your apartment Venn diagram, but you can't have all three. You got to choose whether you want to be a Jewish country that controls all these people and all this land, but then you won't be a democracy, or you'll be a democracy and control all these people and all this land, but eventually you won't be a Jewish country. And then the last remaining option, the one that Ben-Gurion put forward, which is I think the one that could maybe save us from all feeling like an emotional and intellectual pretzel, right, is the one where Israel does what Ben-Gurion said. And the question now is that still a possibility? Is it too late for that? I would submit that the biggest obstacle is a lack of political will, not political imagination. And I think that, one of my publicists is here, Lauren, and we often laugh because the most critical reviews that the book gets are from people who sort of say he's too hopeful. And he's too even-handed. That was Lauren's favorite podcast. Who said they called me irritatingly even-handed. But I think that I'm very proud.
I mean, it is irritating.
It is, sure.
Yeah.
It's less satisfying. But I guess I think that's the way out of that conundrum. Is Israel coming to the recognition and realizing, as it sort of has in fits and starts, but then it goes back, right? That there is no future this way, and I suspect that would make it a lot easier for everybody else, right, to untie themselves from that pretzel. But I think, to your original point about how this makes us feel, maybe you don't want to go there, but I'll put out there that I do think what's different about this than America. And by the way, for those of us in the room, I think that for a lot of African Americans and Native Americans, it does feel as much as a crazy making, emotionally laden exercise as Israel does for so many people. But for so many people, Israel feels different because, there really was an existential threat to the Jewish people in the lifetime of people sitting in this room, right? Not ancient history, like my mom, who is maybe or maybe not watching from Washington, D.C. My wife is shaking her head. She's not watching.
No.
Right, so there are people in this room with us today who were kids when every Jew in the world was facing the threat of murder from Hitler. So that's very real, and we, not just that generation, but those of us who've come after, have an understandable kind of communal post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of what was a real thing in living memory. And so too Palestinians who really remember being forced out at gunpoint, right, from their homes and disenfranchised. And then you go and you look at how, this is what it gets really interesting. And this was the original title of the book, as you may recall.
Yes.
What gets really interesting is the way that I was just in the UK. I slipped in between Delta and the new one, right? So, and so were you. Yeah. And one of the things that was so interesting was to sort of have conversations with people in the British New Israel Fund community who face very different sets of challenges than we do here. I'm not assuming everyone is in that community in this room, but I happen to know that many of you are. But you know, there, they sort of say, and look what happens here in Europe, where otherwise liberal, open-hearted, sane liberals, you know, channel this level of invective and opprobrium towards Israel in the way that they don't towards China or Iran or Syria or Pakistan.
Right.
And they will say, and you know, that's not unrelated to the fact that in living memory, it was their parents and grandparents who were actually either committing or facilitating, right, the murder of the Jews, or, you know, in many cases, not letting them into their countries. So, and then you look at the Christian Zionists in this country, who, by the way, are not a fringe group, but who are a mainstream evangelical fundamentalist group of Protestantism, who boast as their most prominent members the immediate past vice president and past secretary of state, who believe in a theological, teleological, end times, you know, idea in which Israel and the Jews have to play a role. And so, if all of those things don't make us crazy, right? Like, then what would make us crazy?
Yeah. Well, they do make us crazy.
Yeah, that's my point. You asked, why is it that it does it, and that's the reason
Yeah.
why.
Well, and so because you led us here, how do we? So often, I think Jews feel that extra attention on Israel, and it feels very convenient for one form or another of anti-Semitism. It feels enthreaded in there that when there is a protest at any university,
Yeah.
that our own defensive reaction, fair and unfair, I think, is why is there a protest about this and not so many places where other terrible things are happening, and that we feel called upon to defend that in a way that we don't see our brothers and sisters from other places being called upon to defend it. And yet, so many of the accusations seem fair. And I think the defense of, oh yeah, but it was really horrible over there and you never complain about that, is never a very strong one when you're having a political argument.
Yeah.
Because you can't talk of everything simultaneously and be upset about everything simultaneously.
Whataboutism, they call
Yeah.
it. Right.
And so but I think both those things are there.
Yeah.
I think a genuine over-examination of the Jewish state over other places, and a perfectly natural flashpoint for bona fide political protest are going on. So how do we work within both those forces that are happening?
Yeah. Well, there's a chapter in the way I arranged the book was the first part of the book is a what I hope is a digestible history, because I really believe, as you can tell, that, and as I said earlier, in order to really know what you're talking about, you probably should try to know what you're talking about a bit. And then the second part of the book goes deep into some of the more difficult and controversial issues that cause people to feel so upset about this. And then I thread throughout it sort of personal anecdotes and stories about my own journey and experiences. But in one of the chapters in part 2, which I call the other A word, there's a chapter that, bless you, called the A word, which is about Israel and the accusation of apartheid. And the next chapter, the other A word, is about anti-Semitism in Israel. And I begin that chapter paraphrasing myself because I don't remember exactly, by saying, is criticism of Israel anti-Semitic? And I answer no. And then parenthetically, except when it is. And then I said, is being an anti-Zionist anti-Semitic? You know, and I write no. And then parenthetically, except when it is. So, right. So it's really hard to figure out what's going on in those situations.
Right.
I will say a few things among friends, even though we may all not agree on all of these things. You know, one of the ways I think that we have to understand criticism of Israel is what I said earlier, that, you know, a lot of people feel a lot of guilt about what happened to the Jews. And sometimes, for all kinds of reasons, when Israel acts like a bad state actor, like a lot of bad state actors, and there are plenty worse, right? It receives a singularity of focus that feels wrong to many of us. It does to me, right? And like the Potter Stewart definition of pornography, sometimes you know it when you see it. The problem is it's really tough because there is an industry, quite literally until recently there was a ministry in the Israeli government devoted to sort of this fight and to propping up a particular perspective on it, and that effort is often echoed and reinforced by the institutions of American and European Jewish communities, which is to say, any criticism of Israel is labeled as anti-Semitic, right? So that doesn't help.
Right.
What also doesn't help is the fact that those other countries that you're mentioning, and here I'm not talking about University of Toronto, let's talk about right here at home, right? They are not the recipient of more United States aid than all other countries combined, right? As is Israel most years. They do not, China, Pakistan, Iran, Syria, Iraq, bad state actors, they do not declare themselves to be a free, open, democratic country, which Israel does, right? And so that all of those factors, the guilt that many people feel, which creates a kind of perverse joy at catching out the Jews in Israel for behaving badly, the fact that the defenders of Israel have labeled all criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, making it difficult to figure out which criticism of Israel actually is anti-Semitic and which is perfectly legitimate, and the fact that Israel actually claims a lot, right, in terms of what it claims to be, what it wants to be, what it sees itself as being, a democracy, right? And when you receive more aid than any other country, it's understandable that American citizens who foot the bill for that aid feel like, well, I do get a say, right? Because I pay for this. I mean,
right.
And so I think that for all those reasons, it becomes really hard to figure out what's going on. What I try to do in the chapter is provide a little mini toolkit to navigate when criticism of Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism. And I'll just give a shout out to Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who runs an organization called Trua, which is a rabbinic human rights organization, who wrote a terrific piece, which I credit and talk about and add on to in the book, in the Washington Post, trying to do just that. So instead of Potter Stewart, I know it when you see it, you now have me and Jill trying to help you figure out when that criticism becomes illegitimate.
I'm glad that you have a better pedigree than identifying pornography as the way of going through. I'm going to read you a question that has been brought up from the audience because I feel this is right at the heart of what we're talking about right now. Someone writes, Israel is the most democratic state, the most diverse state in the region. It isn't perfect, but please explain why you choose now to present your theories, and which I think is often a response that we hear, right? And so, and on one hand, we can say, we can find an element of hypocrisy that is particularly upsetting to say when you declare yourself to be this and you're behaving in this way, it's more upsetting to us. But I think there's also a sense of things are so fragile now.
Yeah.
This is happening now. Is this the time to wrestle with this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just say, I just love that these questions are coming live. Like, I love seeing someone collecting questions.
This just in.
It's really like such a relief. Look, I mean, I think that, right, I sort of, I think, tried to answer some of that, not knowing that question was coming. The now issue, my wife, who is also sitting right here, used to always say when we were thinking about having kids, and I would say, like, well, is it the right time? And she was like, it's never the right time to have kids. And I feel like strangely, that logic also applies here. And one of the reasons why it seems apt to me is like, I'm a person who's loved this place. This is just my opinion, right? And been totally emotionally connected to and attached to it since I'm 16 years old. And when I was in college and I sort of became the person who I am, when it came to my positions on this place and how I felt about it, as a person who I would proudly describe myself as a progressive or liberal, pro-Israel person, a liberal Zionist, it seemed to me that dissent and patriotic constructive criticism, what in the Jewish tradition we call tochecha, right, loving rebuke, was it was, I was incredulous to hear that wasn't appropriate. And the problem with the now argument is when I was 16 years old, it was 1984. And I was told then, not now, right? You can't say that now. And when I was in college in 1987, when the first Intifada broke out, and again, my brilliant wife and you both told me, don't put this in the book. So I didn't, but I'm going to say it here. Woody Allen. Okay, but this is before, it was before, right? Woody Allen wrote this letter to the editor in the New York Times. Does anyone remember this? I went back and found it and reread it. It made such a huge impression on me. And this is when we all still liked him, before we knew, right? And he wrote this kind of heartbroken op-ed or letter to the editor to the Times, in which he said, I can't believe what I'm seeing on the news. Like, I always put my money in the little pushkis. I love Israel. I'm so proud of Israel, but I'm watching it. You're breaking people's arms because they're throwing stones. You're bashing their heads in because they don't want to be stop the checkpoints, and they don't want to see these settlements continue to grow. This isn't the Israel I thought I knew. And he was told in 1987, not now. You can't say that now. And then, you see where I'm going with this answer.
Yeah.
Right? So I'll stop there and to say every step of the way, people who have wanted to offer loving criticism of Israel are told, not now. It's dirty laundry. Israel's too vulnerable. I really sympathize and empathize with the feeling behind that concern. But I don't think it works, right? And I think that, again, tochecha, like loving rebuke, or what we would call tough love, friends not letting friends drive drunk, that's what it means to be in relationship with a person or a place, is to sort of say, from a place of love and support, right? I think you gotta change. And I'll tell you one example in response to the question. Jimmy Carter is a person who is still pilloried in some corners of the Jewish community for the fact that he strong-armed Menachem Begin and, to a lesser degree, Anwar Sadat during 13 days at Camp David in the late 1970s to come to a peace agreement. Egypt, with the possible exception now of Iran, is in the history of the state of Israel the only country that posed an existential threat to Israel, that could have, in terribly different circumstances, actually posed an existential threat to Israel. Menachem Begin did not want to sign the Camp David agreement because he did not want to give up the Sinai settlements. Israel began building Jewish settlements also in the Sinai, not just the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem and the Golan after the Six-Day War. He didn't want to give them up. But Carter said to his cabinet and to his advisors, look, there's no future for this place if it doesn't get rid of this. Like, it's going to be at war forever, and it's going to build out these settlements. And as he said many decades later in a book which gained him no love, he wrote a book called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, in which he argued, it seemed radical then, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, maybe not now, two-state solution is the only way forward, he argued. Well, that's what he was arguing in Camp David, and for that he received the undying animosity of many people in the Jewish community. But Jimmy Carter spoke truth to Israel. He even pushed Israel beyond what it wanted to do, and not a single Israeli soldier has died fighting an Egyptian. Not a single Israeli civilian has died as a result of an Egyptian air raid since 1973, right? So I guess I would answer, the time will always be wrong to sort of try to say the right thing.
Thank you. Your book describes such moments as as what you've been telling us now. It's true you didn't put Woody Allen in it for reasons I think we all understand.
Because you and Dana told me I couldn't put Woody Allen in it.
If you listen to me more, everything would be better. Your book, in general, though, takes, I would say, elegantly and quickly through Israel's history in order to place kind of current turmoil in necessary context. But I guess to push back on that plan a little bit, if only as a platform for you to speak more about it, how much history is necessary? At what point does digging through old conflict weigh us down more than it moves us forward? Because it often feels to me, if you dig into any historical conflict, you end up with generations of pain and suffering. And at what point do you say, this is not something that we're going to be able to go back and untangle there. This is something that we have to start now with. So how crucial do you think knowing this history is of the region to understanding what we might do?
Well, that's a really good question. And I sort of have a quick two-part answer, right? And the first part is, as I've said earlier, I think if you don't understand the real trauma that resulted from the real recent and not recent history of the Jewish people, then it seems to the observer, and this is what we see at some college campuses and in some of the discourse now, that Israel, and we hear the frame again and again these days, it's just a settler colonial project that went in to uproot an indigenous population. And of course, that's not why the Jews went to Palestine, Israel. They definitely went to secure a homeland for the Jewish people, but that wasn't because of some notion of manifest destiny,
right,
or some notion, by the way, it was not because of some notion that we were the chosen people and it was ours. That did come, it came later, mostly after 67. They went because, in the words of my daughter Noah, after my wife and I took the kids to the Anne Frank house, and we sat down to process it when they were much younger, and Noah said, but why didn't Anne and her family go to America? And we explained why. Or England, or any of the good countries, she said. And we said, because none of the good countries would take them in. So if you don't know that, then I understand why you would think, Israel should be targeted for all the things that people want to target it for.
Right.
And similarly, if you buy the line that you hear from propagandists on the other side, that there's no such thing as a Palestinian people, and they were, people have actually said to me, right, to me, you would have to really have some chutzpah to say this to me. The Palestinians, they just came a century ago. And this is like a ahistorical nonsense, but there's an industry out there to promote that belief too. Then you could understand why, they're really just a bunch of terrorist agents who were sent in, at the last minute. Right. So I think it's important to understand the history, to identify, to both understand the need to empathize with both parties to this conflict, and to call out the BS and understand what the nonsense is. That's part one. And part two is an area where you and I might actually disagree, a conversation that we've been having in drips and drabs over the years. I think when you bury the past, you're the expert on horror books and scary things.
Yeah.
When you bury the past, it tends to come up and come back and get you. And I am a true believer in the disinfectant quality of sunlight and of truth and reconciliation processes and in historical accounting and honesty. And I've not seen a place, right, not even in South Africa itself, right? The fear was if we change and if we admit what's happening, they'll murder us all, they'll drive us out. And that's not what happened, right? And it's not what happened in the Central American countries that went through truth and reconciliation processes. So I think that I do understand, and again, empathize and sympathize with this idea that if you tinker around too much in the past, then you're just going to create a situation like Northern Ireland where you have 500 years of people kind of fetishizing that past. But once Northern Ireland engaged in something like a truth and reconciliation process, that was part of ending the conflict there. So I'm firmly in belief that it's best to talk about.
Yeah, I don't think we're in disagreement about that.
Well, it was more
actually.
fun to make you a straw man of disagreement.
No,
Yeah.
I understand that. Yeah, and I think
Why do you want to bury the past, Daniel?
I think your book lays bare, I think, what feels like an important universal truth that so often the accidental feels inevitable, and when the accidental feels inevitable, then things feel like they can't change, because why would they change? They've been this way forever. And when you realize that they have not been that way forever, that they didn't have to be that way forever, that you see more flexibility in the world than the world can confront you with when you're looking at it. So
That's a beautiful point. Thank you.
Thanks.
For saying that.
On that, I think on this is an interesting question that had not occurred to me when reading your book. How important is it that Israel be in the location that it is, the most disruptive place on earth for it to be?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people here probably know that in the history of the early Zionist movement, and I'm talking, mid-late 19th century, all kinds of ideas were floated about where Israel could be. And in fact,
not that many years ago, my wife and I met a man who owns a great deal of land in Virginia, and he just was like, I'll give it, I think he was very eager to talk to Jews. He was like, tell them, and I was like, It's not really how it works. We're kind of a mafia and we're kind of not, but I definitely can't get everybody to move to Virginia. I don't have that kind of sway.
Well, I mean, Israel is a country on a political knife's edge, much like our own, but let's say that half of the 9 million people are kind of liberal-minded. Let's even say it's a third. If you have 3 million people, right, and we say you can all come to Wyoming, right, and Montana, the Republicans love the Israelis. We get the liberal Israelis to move there, Jew and Arab alike, and then we have 4 new Democratic senators. No, but look, I mean, there were lots of early Zionist thinkers who actually didn't really care that much where Israel. What they saw was the need for Jewish self-determination in an age defined by 19th century nationalism and the desire for self-determination, right? And as the Zionists were prescient, right? They were thought to be insane by most of us, but they were right. Their analysis as early as the 1880s was, it's going to end badly in Europe. And they thought Jewish self-determination is the only answer. And what's so crazy, back to your, what makes us all feel like, because they were right, right? That they were also correct in assessing that was really the only answer. I mean, it didn't have to be, to your, point a moment ago.
Yeah.
If America had said, no, you can all come here, or Canada or Australia, any of the good countries. But given the restraints, that was the only answer. And they didn't care where it was, some of them, the early ones. And in fact, there were huge debates at the early Zionist congresses. And Herzl himself, the sort of most known early Zionist figure, he sort of played with other ideas. And so everything from, they call it Uganda, but it was really British East Africa, probably now what is Kenya. That wouldn't have turned out very well. People talked about Madagascar. There were all kinds of conversations about different places. Ultimately, the unifying power, for those of you who are not Jewish in the room, every year at Passover, at the Passover holiday, we conclude the Seder, the traditional meal, by saying next year in Jerusalem. And the Jewish prayer book is full of references to Israel and Zion and Jerusalem. So it really was they were great PR people. They understood that that was the thing that could unify people. So they sort of won out. But I'm reminded of a joke as many people in my generation had in their homes growing up, the big book of Jewish humor. Right? There we go. And there was a joke that I always thought was so wild. It's God talking to Moses, and God says, Moses, you've been such a great servant. I'm going to give you people a country, and you can have any country in the world. Which one do you want? And Moses, we learned from the actual Torah, had a speech impediment, right? He often thought to be a stutter. It's like one of the few descriptions of who he was. He had a speech impediment. So in the joke, God says, I'll give you any country you want. And Moses says, I'm taking Canada. But he can't get it out. He's stuttering. And God hears that first syllable, ka, ka, ka. And he says, you want Canaan? All right. I don't know why, but you can have it. So, I mean, I don't know if it's practical. Your solution of moving them to your friend's place in Virginia is practical. But the answer is that's where history arrived. At that place, at that moment, at that time, again, if FDR in 1935 had said, look, I'm opening the doors to total Jewish immigration, in my opinion, the Yishuv, the pre-state Jewish community in Palestine, which was tiny even then, right, would have ultimately probably shriveled up and blown away. But that's not how it worked.
Right. So speaking of American presidents who have done things wrong, do you feel, I felt reading your book and rereading parts of it today, that perhaps a strange silver lining of the Trump era was that to feel that our country's democracy threatened made the precariousness of democracy and the direness of threats to democracy that much clearer when looking at Israel. I think a lot of the debate around Israel strays from democracy because there's so many things to make us crazy.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you think that a threat to democracy here can be a clarifying tonic in a way to look at what's happening in Israel.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I have a colleague with whom I work here, and I think what we all found at New Israel Fund internationally was that something happened in 2016 where the job of being the professional team of the New Israel Fund, and I'm sure many of our supporters who are our great ambassadors felt the same way, it suddenly was clarified and made easier in a way that we couldn't have possibly imagined, because previously people who said, again, why are you airing dirty laundry, or more prevalently, it can't be true what you're saying. Right? It can't be. That's not the story of Israel I know. You just told me that Israel passed a law that forbids Arab Israeli schools and institutions and community centers from commemorating the events of May 1948 as the Nakba, the catastrophe. And a law that says if they do that, they'll lose funding, you made it up. It can't be true. And by the way, I didn't make it up. It is true. After Trump's election, that kind of disappeared. And I think around the world, like when I speak with human rights activists who work on other areas, we all talk to each other. This was something universally that was found. And what was really poignant, I remember speaking to a Russian human rights activist who now works at an American foundation. And she said, she said, in all the horror of this moment, of the Trump, Putin kind of disinformation, illiberal democracy moment, at least she said, you understand that we're not crazy. And so, yeah, I think it was very clarifying.
And then this is, I believe, from someone in our virtual audience. Hello, virtual people. Shifting the focus to the American left, has the social justice movement in the United States damaged Israel or the view of Israel?
Well, I don't know, or I guess I don't think that the social justice movement in the United States has damaged Israel, but I do think that there are parts of the social justice movement in the United States that don't know what they're doing when it comes to Israel. And I'm saying that live, right, on recorded video. I think we have a real problem, right? I mean, I'm often accused of all kinds of things that people think are detrimental to Israel. So here's something. I reject those accusations, but but I do see on the American left and on the European left a growing intolerance born of, frankly, the kind of ignorance I'm trying to confront in the book about Israel and about its role. And I think a good example of that is something that happened, that is happening over the last 24 hours. Jamal Bowman, a very progressive congressman from New York City, who, by the way, replaced a long-sitting, I believe, Jewish member of Congress who was a great favorite of the Jewish community, but demographics are changing. He's a black guy. He is sort of associated with the left wing of the party, and he's part of the Democratic Socialists of America. But he's also a really smart guy. And he went on a CODEL, a congressional delegation, 2 weeks ago with J Street to Israel, Palestine. And he met with NIF grantees and activists. They would all send me the pictures of the selfies he took with them. He's a very charismatic, really smart guy. And he has been quite forthright in his criticism of Israeli policy. But the Democratic Socialists of America are involved in an internal civil war the last 24 hours, as one faction is demanding that he be kicked out of the DSA because he went with J Street, right, which is the Zionist lobby. And I saw something I never thought I would see today. Dozens of tweets from Palestinian activists saying, "Are you people out of your mind?" Right? Like, these are not the enemies. So I think that in that sense, there's a real problem going on. And it's predicated in no small part on people not really taking the time to understand what is different and what is similar about these two situations.
We are running out of time, but I wanted to talk before we go for a minute about despair, because I love talking about despair. In our friendship, early on, I was struck by a difference between us where sometimes we get together and I say, everything's a complete nightmare because of this tiny, completely invisible thing that is happening in a small aspect of children's book publishing in America. And that you would say, no, everything's going fine based on my work with the Israel-Palestinian conflict that's been going on. So one of us is right. But
You're probably right.
but I mean, but as you mentioned, your book has gotten some criticism. I mean, I think it's too easy to say it's criticized for being hopeful. I think it's criticized for centralizing hope as the primary way by which we might move forward. And I think that that's I think the temptation towards despair when thinking about long, intractable situations is almost overwhelming. And I don't think anyone who has lived with events in Israel at any time in our lives has not experienced a kind of a really deep despair that comes from loving a place and worrying about it. And I'm curious, like what you find as the source of hope. You have a beautiful description of living in Israel during the Oslo peace talks and feeling that there, but that feels very tied to a particular historic moment that we didn't get to explore much today. But I'm curious kind of where you find hope, and how hope might bring us out of despair and even perhaps into progress.
Yeah. Well, I'm lucky. I'm blessed constitutionally with a glass half full kind of attitude. So are you, really. But look, I think, right, the criticism is the book and I offer little more than hope. But what I think is a little unfair about that is that my hope is generated by a real thing. And I try to present what that real thing is in the last chapter of the book, which I call The Case for Hope. And you know, when you work for the New Israel Fund for as long as I have, and when you've lived and been shoulder to shoulder with people on the ground who every day, without like having a lot of time for the despair that we may feel 9,000 miles away reading the paper or thinking about this once or twice in our day or week or month or year, people who live the reality every year, they're not given to despair. And I understand from my elders that one of the things that was characteristic of some of the great civil rights leaders is that they also didn't really have a lot of time for despair here in this country. And I think the thing where I find hope is in a twofold place. First, it's from the people on the ground who don't have time for despair, who are working every day to build a different kind of future. And they're not an abstract, you know, and they're not. What's the Margaret Mead quote, right? You know, don't. I'm going to bungle it, but
small group of concerned citizens.
Yeah, never think that that's ineffective. They're the only thing that ever changes anything, and that's been my experience. And so that's part one. I get hope from the people on the ground who know what they're doing and know the situation, and who continue pushing. And sort of and then I get hope from the sweep of history, right? One, you know, has anyone read Taylor Branch's trilogy about Martin Luther King's life and the civil rights movement? It's amazing, and I highly recommend it. 3 volumes.
Your bar mitzvah gift to my son.
Our bar mitzvah gift to your son.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Way to go. So the first volume of the book, by the way, the first volume is called Parting the Waters, and the second one is called Pillar of Fire, and the third one is called At Canaan's Edge. So there you go. But the first 300 pages of the first, 900-page book, I'm sure Otto has read them all by now.
Obviously.
So the first several hundred pages are devoted to people I had never heard of, who lived lives that ended decades or more before anything changed or happened, and without whom, right, none of the things that did change would have happened. The people who, during the worst part of the failure of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, soldiered on, right, building a movement, building an ethos of what that movement was. So
not living to see the movement.
And not living to see the movement ever, right? So that's part one of the second part. And part two of the second part is you don't know what's going to happen without those people, right? Without those people in Taylor Branch's book, and without our grantees and the activists in Israel-Palestine who are working beneath the radar, They're not in the headlines. You don't read about them unless you get our emails, right? Without them, nothing will change. But one day something will change, or at least something can change. Nobody sees, right, F.W. de Klerk open the gates on Robben Island and Mandela work out. Nobody thinks that Israel's most decorated soldier is going to suddenly say, we can't go on and we have to stop this. No one thinks that a black guy is one day going to get elected president of the United States, but these things happen. And history isn't teleological, right? As Seamus Heaney says, sometimes hope and history rhyme. And that's where my hope comes from.
Well, that's wonderful. I know there are more questions, some of which I couldn't read. And I know that there's that this is never the end of the discussion. But I believe Mr. Sokach will be signing books over in the next room where perhaps the conversation can continue. Thank you so much for joining us here in the actual Commonwealth Club and in the virtual Commonwealth Club out in the world. Thank you very much.